People assume this story is simple. They picture a fast food chain, burgers flipping on grills, happy families in booths, and a business that grew because people loved the food. But anyone who digs deeper discovers something far more complex and unsettling. The company didn't scale because its menu was irresistible. It didn't dominate because it perfected service speed or cleanliness. Behind the bright golden arches, there was a strategy invisible to most, a strategy so quietly ruthless it could reshape entire cities. The foundation wasn't built on hamburgers. It was built on control, leverage, and land, a type of power that survives recessions, crashes, and trends. And it all began with a problem the founders never fully understood, a problem so severe it could have destroyed everything before it ever reached the first franchise. What happened next would not only redefine the company, but completely change the fast food industry's playbook, and almost nobody noticed. In the early days, the original founders were obsessed with efficiency. They refined the kitchen workflow to a point where service was faster than anything anyone had seen. Customers loved it, competitors marveled at it, but the real challenge was profitability. Margins were razor thin, and scaling the operation was almost impossible without outside capital. Franchises were enticing, but most investors hesitated because the financial stability was shaky. Profits fluctuated, costs were unpredictable, and even a small failure could wipe out an operator. Then a salesman entered the picture, someone with a sharp eye for systems and a sense of timing. He saw potential in the operation, but immediately recognized a hidden flaw. The model itself, fast, efficient, replicable, was brilliant, but it could never create lasting wealth if it relied solely on selling food. This flaw would force him to consider a completely different path, one that few people in business had ever imagined. As he approached potential investors, he realized the scale problem was far bigger than anticipated. Franchisees were interested, but only if they could be sure the investment wouldn't collapse under pressure. He faced skepticism on every side. Banks, small investors, and even well-known business figures looked at the company and shook their heads. They weren't questioning the concept, they were questioning the stability. A business dependent entirely on other people's operations is inherently fragile. At that moment, he understood a brutal truth. The company didn't own its destiny. It owned no assets of significance. Every location was a tenant in someone else's building. Every lease was a ticking time bomb. And in the world of empire building, you can't control what you don't own. The realization was chilling, but it would soon ignite a strategy that no competitor could see coming. Rather than abandoning the idea, he reimagined the business from the ground up. If the company couldn't rely solely on operational profits, it needed a backbone that was immovable and predictable. Something tangible, something that generated power regardless of whether a franchise succeeded or failed. He looked at historical empires, railroads, oil companies, retail giants, and noticed a pattern. Ownership of infrastructure created lasting influence. Companies that controlled real estate controlled markets. The idea was audacious. Instead of simply running restaurants, the company would become a landlord. Every franchisee would operate on property owned by the company, paying rent that ensured a constant, predictable cash flow. The shift wasn't minor. It meant changing the company's identity from a food operation into a real estate powerhouse, without anyone outside noticing the transformation. This move would allow the business to expand at a pace others could not imagine, but it also required mastering a world they had never dealt with before, real estate strategy on a massive scale. He established a two-layered system. One entity managed operations, branding, and franchise support. The other acquired property, leased it to franchisees, and guaranteed long-term returns regardless of market fluctuations. This solved the core problem investors had feared for years: unpredictable revenue. Even if a franchise struggled, rent payments kept the cash flow secure. Even if consumer tastes changed, the underlying asset, the land, would continue to appreciate. With this approach, every new location wasn't just another restaurant, it was a strategic investment. The company no longer depended entirely on the performance of its franchises. Instead, it created leverage, shifting power firmly in its own hands. Franchisees needed the brand, but the brand now owned the ground they operated on. Yet this newfound control introduced tension. Franchisees, investors, and even the founders themselves didn't immediately understand the full implications of this transformation. The shift toward land ownership transformed the company into something that outlived mere burgers. It could now generate revenue from every corner of the globe, secure wealth in times of crisis, and scale aggressively without exposing itself to operational risks. This approach remained largely invisible to the public. To most, it still looked like a chain selling fast food. But behind the scenes, the company was quietly building a financial fortress. Every franchise was a node, every property a fortress wall. The initial problem that threatened the company had become the doorway to its most formidable strategy, a strategy that would define not just the business, but the way we think about franchising and corporate power forever. And yet, as the empire grew, an unexpected conflict was brewing that would test the company's model in ways no one could have predicted. By the time the company's first wave of franchise locations was operational, the groundwork for its real estate strategy had already been laid. Most franchisees thought they were signing up for a partnership in a food business. They weren't thinking about rent agreements, property ownership, or the hidden architecture of control. The company, however, saw each new site as a calculated acquisition. Every lease, every piece of land, every strategic corner in a high-traffic area was meticulously chosen. The brilliance of this approach was subtle but absolute. While competitors focused on marketing campaigns, menu innovations, and celebrity endorsements, the company was quietly controlling the very ground their competitors relied on. Every time someone opened a franchise, the company wasn't just collecting revenue, it was building leverage that could never be easily replicated. But even the best-laid plans encounter friction. Franchisees began to notice the rent structures, the layers of control, and the hidden fees that came with leasing from the company. Not all were happy about it, and resistance started bubbling beneath the surface. This tension would soon reveal cracks in the relationship between growth and control that the company hadn't fully anticipated. Expansion wasn't just about choosing prime locations, it required capital. The company had to negotiate with banks, investors, and landowners, often operating in uncharted territory. While it had a system that ensured predictable cash flow, executing it in the real world was far messier than theory. Deals fell through, property values fluctuated, and unexpected zoning issues emerged. Each failure, however, became a lesson. The company's approach was relentless: control the land first, then let the operational side follow. It didn't matter if a franchise struggled for months or even years. As long as rent continued, the empire's foundation remained intact. This method created resilience that competitors simply couldn't match. Traditional fast food chains relied entirely on operations to generate profit, leaving them exposed to market swings, consumer trends, and human error. The company's model insulated it from all of that. But a hidden danger lurked. By becoming a landlord first and a food business second, it was exposing itself to legal and ethical challenges that could escalate faster than it could handle. Internally, not everyone agreed with this dual-structure strategy. Some executives were convinced that focusing too much on real estate would distract from the core product, the food. They feared that customers might notice and the brand's reputation could suffer. Others argued that operational excellence had to remain the primary focus to keep franchisees motivated. This tension created heated debates behind closed doors, and at one point, the disagreement threatened to split the company's leadership. The founder's salesman remained unwavering. He understood that controlling the land was a far more powerful lever than controlling kitchens. Without it, expansion would always be limited, and the company would be vulnerable to outside pressures, lawsuits, competition, and market volatility. His insistence on this principle was not popular, but it was effective. The strategy required patience, discipline, and a willingness to appear indifferent to criticism. Soon, this internal conflict would reach a tipping point, forcing the company to make decisions that would define its future. As the company continued its aggressive growth, it began negotiating long-term leases with franchisees in ways that gave it unprecedented control. The terms were structured so that even if a franchisee underperformed, the company retained the right to take over the location or adjust fees to secure cash flow. Many franchisees didn't fully understand the implications when signing. This method effectively shifted risk from the company to the franchisee. It was a genius, almost ruthless move, but one that required careful calculation. Over time, as the number of locations multiplied, the company accumulated a network of properties that became increasingly valuable. Suddenly, the company's balance sheet looked completely different from any competitors. It didn't just have revenue, it had assets, tangible, appreciating, nearly untouchable assets. Competitors remained focused on menu innovation and marketing campaigns, oblivious to the quiet transformation occurring beneath the surface. The real genius of the model emerged in its scalability. Once a location proved successful, the company had the leverage to open more in similar high-traffic areas, effectively creating a template for growth. Every new site reinforced the value of existing locations, while the cumulative network amplified the company's power over the market. Additionally, this system allowed the company to weather crises that would cripple rivals. Economic downturns, regional recessions, or even poor-performing outlets didn't threaten the empire. Rent continued to flow, land value appreciated, and operational failures became minor annoyances rather than existential threats. It was the kind of resilience that created generational wealth, and all of it was hidden behind the guise of a fast food chain. But even such dominance has a price. Every decision, every lease, and every new location carried the weight of potential conflict with franchisees, regulators, and local authorities. By now, the company was no longer merely a restaurant chain. It was a sophisticated real estate network operating under the cover of a food brand. Investors began to notice, and suddenly the business looked radically different in financial terms. The dual-layered structure insulated it from the volatility of consumer trends, while the empire of landholdings ensured long-term growth and leverage. Yet the transformation was not without consequences. Franchisees who resisted, markets that pushed back, and legal boundaries created constant tension. Each move requires strategic foresight, patience, and ruthless calculation. The company's ability to survive and thrive was now tied to its mastery over property, leases, and leverage as much as, if not more than, the menu it sold. And in the coming years, this control would allow the company to expand faster and more dominantly than anyone could have imagined, setting the stage for a level of power unseen in the fast food world. By the mid-1960s, the company had grown into a network that few fully understood. To outsiders, it was still a fast food chain, an icon of Americana. But internally, it was something far more sophisticated. The combination of operational control and real estate ownership created leverage few could match. Every franchise was effectively a tenant, every lease a contract that guaranteed the company both income and influence. Growth was no longer dependent on the whims of consumers, but on a precise formula that had been perfected over years of trial and error. Yet, even as the empire expanded, tension simmered beneath the surface. Franchisees, though thriving in many cases, began noticing the disparity between the revenue the brand generated for them and the rent they paid. Some started to quietly question the fairness of the system. The first real confrontation was looming, one that would test whether the model could survive scrutiny and opposition simultaneously.
The first wave of resistance came from franchisees who felt trapped. They had signed agreements that seemed favorable at the start, but as the company's empire grew, the weight of rent obligations became clear. The company's leverage was absolute. Lease agreements gave it the right to dictate terms and take over locations if performance lagged. To most franchisees, this was an invisible but inescapable pressure. Internally, the leadership remained firm. The founder salesman understood that bending to every complaint would undermine the entire strategy. Each negotiation with a franchisee became a battle of wills. Legal teams were brought in, leases were enforced rigorously, and the company's control tightened. It wasn't cruelty, it was calculation. And in this delicate balance between power and rebellion, the company was quietly testing the limits of its own empire. Meanwhile, the real estate side of the business continued to grow aggressively. Prime locations were identified not just for their immediate profitability, but for long-term strategic dominance. Intersections, shopping centers, highway exits, each piece of land was selected with foresight. By controlling the physical footprint of its network, the company could block competitors from gaining access to high-value areas. This level of strategic thinking was unprecedented in the fast food world. Competitors were focused on expanding quickly and marketing aggressively, but they overlooked the real determinant of power: control over infrastructure. By the end of the decade, the company's portfolio of properties had become a financial engine far larger than the operating profits of the restaurants themselves. However, with such rapid acquisition came risks that the company could not ignore. Regulatory scrutiny, zoning disputes, and the occasional legal challenge threatened to undermine the carefully constructed system. The tension between operations and property management became a central theme in the company's boardroom. Some executives argued for more emphasis on food innovation, fearing that a purely financial focus would erode the brand's image. Others insisted that the empire's stability depended on the land strategy above all else. The founder salesman was resolute. He knew that operational tweaks could improve revenue temporarily, but control of the land ensured survival and dominance for decades. To enforce this strategy, the company refined its lease agreements further, incorporating clauses that protected its interests and guaranteed predictable returns. Franchisees could operate independently in daily decisions, but the overarching leverage always rested with the company. The network was no longer a collection of individual restaurants. It was a tightly controlled ecosystem designed for maximum advantage. And yet, this increasing control set the stage for a confrontation that would test the system's resilience like never before. At the same time, the company's approach began attracting attention from investors and financial analysts. The dual structure, operations separate from real estate, was revolutionary. Analysts began to recognize that the company's true value lay not in burger sales, but in the accumulation of high-quality assets that appreciated over time. This insight transformed perceptions in the financial world. Suddenly, the company was not just a fast food brand. It was a model for predictable, scalable, long-term wealth. The realization came with a consequence. The company's methods could no longer remain invisible. Franchisees became more aware, competitors began studying the model, and the media started to investigate the empire behind the arches. The very success of the system attracted scrutiny, and scrutiny can destabilize even the most sophisticated operations. The next few years would determine whether the company could maintain control or whether the pressures from outside and inside would force it to compromise its strategy. By the early 1970s, the company had achieved a scale that few imagined possible. Its network of restaurants and properties formed a web of influence that stretched across the United States and into international markets. Yet the most powerful moves were often unseen. Each lease reinforced leverage. Each location blocked competitors. Each acquisition strengthened long-term financial stability. The food was a mask. The empire was the true story. But no empire exists without challenges. Franchisees pushing back, regulators scrutinizing leases, and internal disagreements about priorities threatened to expose vulnerabilities. The company's leadership understood that sustaining dominance required constant vigilance, strategic patience, and an almost ruthless willingness to enforce control. What happened next would cement the company's reputation not just as a fast food chain, but as a model for combining operations and real estate into a virtually unstoppable business strategy.
As the company crossed into international markets, the stakes changed dramatically. Domestic expansion had been calculated, predictable, almost surgical. But foreign markets introduced a new array of challenges: unfamiliar regulations, cultural differences, and competitive landscapes that couldn't be controlled through formula alone. The real estate strategy that had worked flawlessly in the U.S. now required adaptation. Every piece of land acquired internationally carried risk. Currency fluctuations, political instability, and local opposition could turn a lucrative deal into a costly failure. The leadership faced a critical question. Could the empire's dual-layer system survive outside the controlled environment of home turf, or was it fundamentally a domestic model disguised as a global solution? The decisions made during this phase would determine whether the company's strategy was universally scalable or merely a localized phenomenon. Early international expansions were cautious but revealing. In some countries, prime locations were already occupied by local competitors. In others, real estate laws restricted long-term leases, threatening the very foundation of the company's model. To overcome this, the leadership experimented with partnerships, joint ventures, and creative leasing structures that maintained control without violating local regulations. Yet each adaptation exposed weaknesses in the system. While the U.S. model relied on predictability and enforceable leases, foreign markets demanded flexibility and negotiation skills that the company had not needed before. Franchisees abroad were often more independent, less willing to accept strict oversight, and more sensitive to rent terms that felt punitive. The company's ability to navigate these tensions would become a defining measure of its strategic genius or its vulnerability. Internally, debates intensified over whether the international strategy should mimic the U.S. approach exactly or adopt a hybrid model. Some executives argued that operational focus must take precedent abroad, emphasizing local tastes, marketing, and staffing. Others insisted that land control could never be compromised, warning that without it, the business would lose leverage. The founder's salesman remained steadfast. He saw the pattern clearly. The empire's power was not in the product, but in the assets that supported it. Allowing exceptions could weaken the model, giving competitors a chance to infiltrate key markets or disrupt cash flow. As negotiations with foreign landlords, government agencies, and franchisees progressed, every new location became a high-stakes test of the company's ability to enforce its system under pressure. Meanwhile, domestic operations were not immune to tension. Some long-standing franchisees resisted rent increases or new clauses in lease agreements, arguing that the company's aggressive real estate tactics were exploitative. Legal battles and heated confrontations ensued, forcing the leadership to make difficult choices: enforce control ruthlessly or risk undermining the system. The company's response was methodical. It enforced leases consistently, demonstrated that operational independence came with obligations, and allowed no precedent that might weaken its leverage. The message was clear: the empire would not bend for sentiment or convenience. This approach solidified dominance, but also sowed seeds of resentment, creating the type of friction that could one day threaten expansion or public perception. By the mid-1970s, the company had achieved a remarkable feat. It controlled a network of restaurants that functioned as operational hubs while simultaneously owning most of the land they occupied. Financially, this created a fortress. Investors began to recognize that the true engine of wealth was not burger sales, but the real estate portfolio underpinning them. Every lease, every property, and every high-traffic location contributed to a web of influence that competitors couldn't penetrate.
The genius of the model became evident. The company could expand at will, enforce control over franchisees, and generate predictable income even in turbulent economic times. The system was self-reinforcing. As the network grew, it became increasingly difficult for competitors to compete in prime locations, and each new franchise strengthened the empire further. Yet, the complexity of this model meant that oversight had to be constant. Even a single mismanaged property could create vulnerabilities, both legally and operationally. By now, the company's identity had fully shifted. To the public, it remained a fast food chain, beloved for its iconic menu and branding. To investors, it was a model of financial engineering. To competitors, it was an enigma, too successful, too organized, too protected by its vast network of assets to challenge directly. But empires are only as strong as their weakest link. Each lease dispute, international negotiation, or franchisee rebellion tested the system, forcing the company to refine processes, assert authority, and sometimes make ruthless decisions. The lessons learned during this period would define the blueprint for decades of global expansion. And the company still had one final transformation ahead, one that would fully reveal the hidden engine behind its empire.
As the company entered the 1980s, its domestic and international footprint had grown to an unprecedented scale. Millions of customers passed through its doors each day, but the true story was hidden in plain sight. Behind the golden arches was a network of assets, leases, and agreements that generated revenue regardless of how many burgers were sold. Each location was a calculated node in a larger strategy, reinforcing the company's dominance in ways competitors could not see, let alone replicate. This invisible architecture created power, but it also required constant vigilance. A misstep in lease enforcement or a poorly negotiated acquisition could unravel months of careful planning. Leadership understood that the empire's strength came not from brand loyalty or menu innovation, but from precise control over the land on which the business operated. The decisions made during this period would determine whether the empire could endure challenges from both the market and within its own network. Despite its success, friction with franchisees intensified. Some long-term operators pushed back against new rent structures, arguing that the company was prioritizing profit over partnership. Legal battles emerged, some stretching for years, threatening to draw attention to the very leverage the company relied upon. Critics accused the company of exploiting its position, but the leadership saw these challenges as necessary friction. Control, they reasoned, required firm enforcement. The dual-layer system allowed the company to absorb these disputes. Operational complaints were often secondary because the lease agreements ensured predictable income. In essence, franchisees were operating businesses, but the empire controlled the foundation beneath them. The message was clear. Freedom in daily operations came at the cost of dependence on the company's property strategy. This balancing act of power and independence was delicate, and a single misstep could create cracks visible to both investors and competitors. Internationally, the company faced challenges that tested its adaptability. Political unrest, changing regulations, and cultural resistance threatened the stability of leased properties. Negotiating with foreign landlords, governments, and franchisees required finesse and persistence. In some cases, the company had to adjust its approach, offering longer-term guarantees or partnerships to secure prime locations. Despite these complications, the principle remained unchanged. Control the land first, let operations follow second. The system worked because it was flexible enough to navigate local conditions, but rigid enough to maintain leverage. Competitors attempting to imitate the model abroad struggled because they lacked both experience and the foresight to see how property could be weaponized as a tool for business dominance. This international test would prove that the empire could sustain itself across borders and regulations, solidifying its strategy as a template for global growth. By the mid-1980s, the company's portfolio of properties had reached a level that few outside the leadership fully comprehended.
Prime locations along highways, in urban centers, and at shopping complexes were no longer just restaurants. They were controlled assets generating long-term wealth. The company could now dictate terms to competitors, influence market access, and expand strategically without risking operational failure. This level of control also allowed the company to innovate in subtle ways. Operational failures, shifts in consumer tastes, or economic recessions no longer posed existential threats. The real estate portfolio acted as a shock absorber, ensuring stability and continuous cash flow. What once seemed like a fast food chain had become a financial institution disguised in a menu and brand identity. Yet the more the empire grew, the more it attracted scrutiny from competitors, governments, and analysts who began to recognize the scale of its unseen power. Challenges escalated in unexpected ways. Some franchisees sought to form coalitions, attempting to challenge the rent structures or assert more autonomy. Legal and political pressures emerged, forcing the company to defend its strategy in courtrooms and public forums. Meanwhile, market competitors attempted aggressive expansion, hoping to secure prime real estate before the company could acquire it. Through it all, the leadership remained disciplined. The dual-layer model, the separation of operations and real estate, proved its strength. Lease agreements were enforced consistently, land acquisitions were prioritized, and expansion continued unabated. The company's network became self-reinforcing, with each new location enhancing the value of the existing properties. The system was no longer theoretical. It had become a near-perfect machine for wealth accumulation and market control. The company had reached a point where its power was visible only to those who looked beyond the menu. By the late 1980s, the empire had fully matured. Restaurants, once thought of as the business's lifeblood, were now the mask for a financial powerhouse. The company's wealth was no longer dependent on sales, advertising, or even customer loyalty. It lay in land, leases, and the network's ability to enforce terms globally. Franchisees operated the stores, but the company owned the ground beneath them. This transformation redefined what it meant to succeed in business. The lesson was clear. The product itself was secondary to control over the assets that enabled expansion. The company had engineered a system where leverage, foresight, and discipline mattered more than menus or promotions. Competitors could replicate the burgers, marketing campaigns, or even operational efficiency, but the real estate engine behind the empire could not be copied easily. And as the company looked toward the 1990s, it faced one final challenge: maintaining dominance while preparing to capitalize fully on the empire it had so carefully built. By the mid-1980s, the company's portfolio of properties had reached a level that few outside the leadership fully comprehended. Prime locations along highways, in urban centers, and at shopping complexes were no longer just restaurants. They were controlled assets generating long-term wealth. The company could now dictate terms to competitors, influence market access, and expand strategically without risking operational failure. This level of control also allowed the company to innovate in subtle ways. Operational failures, shifts in consumer tastes, or economic recessions no longer posed existential threats. The real estate portfolio acted as a shock absorber, ensuring stability and continuous cash flow. What once seemed like a fast food chain had become a financial institution disguised in a menu and brand identity. Yet the more the empire grew, the more it attracted scrutiny from competitors, governments, and analysts who began to recognize the scale of its unseen power. Challenges escalated in unexpected ways. Some franchisees sought to form coalitions, attempting to challenge the rent structures or assert more autonomy. Legal and political pressures emerged, forcing the company to defend its strategy in courtrooms and public forums. Meanwhile, market competitors attempted aggressive expansion, hoping to secure prime real estate before the company could acquire it. Through it all, the leadership remained disciplined. The dual-layer model, the separation of operations and real estate, proved its strength. Lease agreements were enforced consistently, land acquisitions were prioritized, and expansion continued unabated. The company's network became self-reinforcing, with each new location enhancing the value of the existing properties. The system was no longer theoretical. It had become a near-perfect machine for wealth accumulation and market control. The company had reached a point where its power was visible only to those who looked beyond the menu. By the late 1980s, the empire had fully matured. Restaurants, once thought of as the business's lifeblood, were now the mask for a financial powerhouse. The company's wealth was no longer dependent on sales, advertising, or even customer loyalty. It lay in land, leases, and the network's ability to enforce terms globally. Franchisees operated the stores, but the company owned the ground beneath them. This transformation redefined what it meant to succeed in business. The lesson was clear. The product itself was secondary to control over the assets that enabled expansion. The company had engineered a system where leverage, foresight, and discipline mattered more than menus or promotions. Competitors could replicate the burgers, marketing campaigns, or even operational efficiency. But the real estate engine behind the empire could not be copied easily. And as the company looked toward the 1990s, it faced one final challenge: maintaining dominance while preparing to capitalize fully on the empire it had so carefully built.
By the 1990s, the company had completed the transformation few had anticipated. What once appeared as a fast food chain was now a sprawling real estate empire. Its network of restaurants, meticulously placed across prime urban and suburban locations, was the visible layer of a deeper system: leases, property ownership, and financial leverage. Every franchisee, knowingly or not, was part of this invisible architecture. The empire had achieved a scale and predictability that competitors could only envy. But dominance brings new challenges. Operating such a vast network required constant vigilance. Market trends shifted, local governments scrutinized leases, and some franchisees began pushing boundaries, testing just how far the company could enforce control. The test wasn't just operational or legal, it was psychological. Could the company maintain discipline while the empire grew, or would the weight of success introduce instability? Segment 2. To manage this, the company refined its internal systems. Corporate oversight expanded, legal teams became critical instruments of strategy, and operational protocols were tightened. Decisions were no longer ad hoc. Every acquisition, every lease, every franchise agreement was executed with precision. The leadership understood that leverage depended not just on owning property, but on enforcing rules consistently. Investors began to recognize that the company's wealth was built less on the sale of burgers and more on the accumulation of high-value real estate. The lesson became obvious. Operational excellence could increase revenue, but real power came from owning the foundation beneath it. The food was a draw, a mask, and a tool, but the empire rested on something far more solid. Even as recognition spread, competitors struggled to adapt. Many had copied operational tactics, but none could replicate the structural control the company wielded globally. Segment 3. Franchisees remain the final variable in this complex equation. Some embraced the system, understanding that their success depended on the brand and its protective infrastructure. Others resisted, attempting to negotiate for more favorable terms or more independence. Each confrontation tested the robustness of the empire. The company's response was calculated: enforce agreements without hesitation, standardize operations to limit risk, and continue acquiring strategic properties. By creating predictability for the empire while maintaining a controlled level of tension with franchisees, the company ensured both compliance and performance. This approach not only preserved stability, but also reinforced the psychological leverage the company held over every partner in the system. Segment 4. Meanwhile, the dual-layer strategy provided unmatched resilience. Economic recessions, regional downturns, and shifts in consumer behavior had minimal impact on overall profitability. Even underperforming franchisees contributed to cash flow through rent, while prime locations appreciated steadily. Expansion could continue without exposing the empire to the volatility inherent in the restaurant business. The genius of the system was finally apparent. The company had converted a simple concept, fast food, into a vehicle for accumulating tangible, appreciating assets. Competitors were trapped in a cycle of operational obsession, blind to the quiet accumulation of wealth happening under the surface. At this stage, it became clear that the empire's long-term success was guaranteed not by burgers, advertising, or menu innovation, but by its mastery of property, leverage, and control. And in the end, the real story isn't about food. It's about foresight, leverage, and the unseen rules that govern lasting success.